Um, so today we're going to be talking about forgiveness. And specifically, I'm going to be looking at how forgiveness is framed in the Bible. And, Christians are famous for being forgiving, or at least that's what we're told that we should do. To err is human, to forgive is divine. Um, and we're told that God is forgiving, so we should be forgiving too. However, as anybody knows who's been alive for a while, forgiveness is a lot easier to hear than it is to do.
Mm.
Forgiveness can be extraordinarily hard to actually do. When we're wronged, the hurt can cut us so deep that it's hard to forgive the other person. So we know that, the advice is we should forgive. And today what we're going to do is we're going to look at a bunch of Bible passages that talk about forgiveness explicitly and implicitly. Most of them actually from the Gospel of Luke, which has some famous stories in it about forgiveness. And we'll be talking about, why should you forgive? What are the advantages of forgiving? And why is it so hard? And I encourage you to talk, frankly about this. And I am recording this, but trust me, if you say anything personal, I'll either leave that out or I won't post the thing at all. So you're in a safe space. Nothing deeply personal will end up on YouTube. And if it turns out that everybody's sharing deeply personal stuff all the time, that's fine. I just won't post it at all on YouTube. YouTube thing's a bonus. This is what we're really here for. So there are, well, first of all, any questions before I get going? Everybody okay? All right. So, and I know that one of you hasn't been at one of these things before. So what I do is I'm going to be showing slides and I'll be encouraging people to take turns reading Bible passages. And I'll just tell you in advance, like the first one that we're going to read in a few minutes has 9 slides in it. And you'll see text and pictures illustrating the story. And I'll just ask for 9 volunteers. And a little bit short, I don't mind filling in the rest. And I just think it's useful for people to hear the Bible coming out of their own mouth. The Bible has become this kind of mysterious document that a lot of people don't read on their own. So here we get a chance to read it and question it and wrestle with it. So let's get started. Forgiveness, I think, sort of can come in 3 forms. The first one is offering forgiveness, right? Hi, Marilyn. Nice to have you with us. The first is offering forgiveness. So that's when you say, I forgive you. And the second would be receiving forgiveness, being forgiven, which can be an enormously powerful thing to have happen to you. And then the third option is refusing to forgive or to receive forgiveness, right? So there's forgiving, being forgiven, and just saying, nope, I just don't want to go there at all. Forgiveness is an opportunity for us to heal ourselves inwardly and also to heal a broken relationship. Because generally speaking, if you don't forgive someone, it becomes hard for you to have an ongoing relationship with them. And that's true not just with other people, but also with God, right? If something has happened, maybe a death in the family, and you blame God for that, that can often be the start of a break in your relationship to God, where you just can't understand how God could have allowed that person to die. That often happens. I hear that from a lot of sort of lapsed Christians, that it was when my mom died or when my son committed suicide, that's when my relationship with God stopped. So forgiveness can be forgiving God, asking for forgiveness, forgiving each other, and refusing to forgive. And that includes refusing to forgive yourself. Sometimes we do things which we know are wrong, which we find deeply upsetting, and we just think are unforgivable. And we just can't forgive ourselves. And that too can be a massive spiritual stumbling block. I think there's a lot of people walking around in the world who are unable to forgive themselves, and as a result, they just sort of get spiritually and psychologically stuck. So today we're going to look at some Bible passages that talk about forgiveness and talk about why it's important, and some of the difficulties in actually doing it. And the first story that I want to use is a famous one. It's the story of the prodigal son. And it's, as you hear this story being read again, just keep in mind we're here to talk about forgiveness. So ask yourself, who is forgiving, who wants forgiveness? You know, where does forgiveness figure in this story? So we need 9 people to read, which is virtually all the people we have here. So if everybody's okay with reading, what I'll do is I'll just call out your names as we go. I'll just call you out in the order that I see you on my screen. And if you can just, and you'll see the passages are all quite short. Okay, so let's get going. So the parable of the prodigal son. And I better spotlight myself for this. Okay, so let's see. Isabel, if you could go first.
Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. Then the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin.
Right. So he tells a couple of little small parables, and then he gets to the parable of the prodigal son. So, and Andre, if you could read the next page, please.
The parable of the prodigal son. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his living between them."
Great, thank you. And Wendy, if you could read this page. Wendy, Wendy with the white sweater on.
Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living.
Great, thank you. And Rosie, if you could read this slide, please.
After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the peas were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death."
Great, thank you. And Jocelyn, if you could read this slide, please.
"I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father."
Great, thank you. And second Wendy Shami, if you could read this, please.
"But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.'"
Great, thank you. And let's see, Marilyn, if you could read the next slide, please. You'll need to unmute yourself though, Marilyn.
Thank you. "But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate."
Terrific, thank you. And Barb, if you could read this page, please.
"Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him.
Great, thank you. And Shirley, if you could read the last slide.
But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found."
Great, thank you. So, folks, what do you think? Any first reactions to that?
The father was really glad that the son had come home under any circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely.
Stephen, you're really good at putting a story into the time element, the time frame that I often get tripped up on. So I don't know anything about inheritance laws at the time. So when the son returns and the father says, "Everything I have is yours." So the son's getting the fatted calf, but he's not getting anything else. Is that correct?
Well, okay, so I'm glad you reminded me. I should give a little bit of historical context on this. Just give me 1 second. I'm just going to turn on an extra light. At the time that this story is written, keep in mind it's a story about some Jews, right? Like, this is a family of Jews. So for Jews at that time, like now, you don't eat pork, right? Do not eat pigs. So the fact that the prodigal son, young man, goes off and he squanders all this money and he ends up taking care of pigs means that he must be working for Gentiles, and he's eating pig food. He's not even getting to eat the pigs, he's eating pig food. So he has hit utter rock bottom. Like, this is the most humiliating situation he could have possibly been in. Okay. So that's one sort of historical bit. The other thing is, as I've mentioned in some of our other sessions about how to read parables, and this is a parable, right? It's not supposed to be a documentary story, it's a parable. There's usually one impossible detail in a parable which twigs you that, aha, this is about spirituality. It's not just about, what it appears to be. And in this case, the young son, who's maybe 17 or 18, walks up to his dad one day and says, "I want a third of the estate. I want my share of the inheritance." Because normally, when the father dies, he would leave the farm to his sons. But this son, who's still alive, says, I want a third of the estate right now," which is a ridiculous thing to ask for. It'd be like one of your kids saying, "Hey, I want to inherit 1/3 of the house now. I want you to take out a second mortgage and give me the money. I'm 17, I'm 18, I'm old enough. Just give it to me and I will be on my way," right? We would never do that. You just don't do that with teenagers. You don't give them a third of it when they're in the stage of life where they're, the least able to make sober, mature decisions, right? They're going to go off and party with it. And it's no different in this story. And yet the father does it. And he said, the way it's written, he gives him 1/3 of his living, right? It's like 1/3 of his life is just walked out the door, right? So this can't possibly be about a real situation where a father gave up property. This story is, Jesus is talking about, what's the kingdom of heaven like? Well, this is a story, it's a parable about spiritual relationships, but it only works if it works on the literal level as well, right? Like, as I've said, you can't say the kingdom of heaven is like a fish riding a bicycle, because fish don't ride bicycles, so that doesn't mean anything, right? But if you say the kingdom of heaven is like a man who had 2 sons, one of whom took his inheritance early, and his loving father gave it to him and said, "You have free will, here's your inheritance, do what you will with it." And he went off and he squandered it. And then what does he realize when he's hit rock bottom? What does the young son realize?
He needs to go
He needs to go home. He needs to see dad.
Yeah, and
Get
why does he need to see dad?
He's the only one he can count on, I think, so far.
Right. And what does he say he's willing to do when he comes home?
To be working with the servants.
Right. He's willing to work as a servant, not as a son, right? He figures
No,
he's
the
forfeited
servant.
his rights as a son. So now he's just going to be a servant. And this too requires a little bit of historical unpacking. Back then, so anytime the New Testament says servant, it really means slave. Okay, they didn't have paid servants. They had free people, and they had enslaved people, and they had people who had been freed from slavery who were no longer slaves. So if you hear the word servant, it means slave. So there's a distinction between basically three categories of people in this story. There's the father who owns everything. There's the two sons who are in line to inherit the whole estate, right? And then there's the servants / slaves. The thing about slaves is they just take orders. They're never going to inherit the big house. They just take orders. You know, go out to the field, come back. Here's your food. Go to bed. Repeat. Right. That's the life of a slave. So for a son to say that he's willing to come back and work as a slave means that he feels he's lost all of his rights as a son. But he's got to survive somehow. And here he is eating pig food in the middle of a famine for a bunch of Gentiles. I'd be better off being a slave in my father's house than I am out here exercising and enjoying my freedom. Right? His personal freedom has led him to a dead end. So now he realizes I would have been better off if I'd stayed with dad. But I can't just walk in as a son because I've burnt that bridge. So I'll just beg if he'll just take me back as a slave. So those are the stakes for him. So what does dad do as this boy comes groveling back?
Welcomes him with love.
Yeah, he doesn't just accept him back, he forgives him.
Right. Yeah, he forgives him. Full honors, you know. Kill the fatted calf, get him a coat, get him some nice shoes. You know, slaves, by the way, weren't allowed to wear shoes. So that's how you knew they were a slave. Walking by anybody barefoot, you knew was a slave. So the fact that he says, get him a good pair of shoes means that I'm accepting him back as a son, not as a slave. Okay, so the father is all forgiving and runs out to see this son. Last person in the world he should go running towards. The son has insulted him, has squandered a third of the fortune of the household, and yet he runs to see him. So, you know, traditionally this story is seen as a parable about God's extravagant grace and love for us, right? That even when you've screwed up, if you come back repentant, saying, I realize I've screwed up, God will embrace you and take you back, no questions asked. And it's funny, right? The story could have just stopped there, right? The kingdom of God is like a father who takes back a repentant son. Could have just stopped there, but it doesn't. It has this coda. And what happens in the coda? What happens with the older son?
He's not quite so forgiving.
Yeah, what's his complaint?
What about me?
That's right. What about me?
It didn't pay to be really well behaved.
Yeah, you're not throwing a party for me, right? And just in terms of this slavery language, do you remember what he says to his dad? I'll show it. It's a very clever use of, here, let me spotlight this so you can all see it. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and I never disobeyed your orders. I've been slaving for you. Right? Like, he, and this is where this story is so clever. It is so clever, because the son who's hit rock bottom says, I'm willing to go back as a slave. But the obedient son, who's done everything right and who's so resentful and, as Marilyn said, unforgiving, he says, all these years I've been slaving for you. No, you haven't. You were my eldest son. You were in line to inherit this whole place. Why do you think you've been slaving for me?
So the older,
Sorry, Shirley?
oh, sorry, Stephen. The older son to me strikes me that he was doing it for the outcome, for what he wanted. It wasn't just doing it for all the right reasons. It's like giving a friend a gift, hoping you get one back,
Yeah. He was being a dutiful son because that's what dutiful sons do. But is he, if sons are supposed to emulate the best qualities of their parents, is he emulating the best qualities of his father?
No.
No, because he's unforgiving, right?
Stephen, on that word of slaving, it also implies sacrifice. So he wasn't just doing what was his role, he was giving beyond that to the point that it was painful if he felt it was slaving. And
he wasn't enjoying it, right? Yeah.
The emotional charge here. Not only did I've been here all these years, but you owe me because I did more than you would have expected of me.
Yeah, that's right. And the fact that he thinks of his brother, when he describes his brother, he says he's been out wasting the inheritance on prostitutes, right? Which, when you hear prostitution within the New Testament, the Old Testament, there's always this sense that it's adultery, right? You're cheating on the one you're supposed to be faithful to by being with a prostitute. And so he's saying, my little brother was out there sleeping with prostitutes. He was cheating on us, on the family business, by spending his money that way, right? Is the older brother soft-hearted or hard-hearted?
Hard-hearted.
Hard-hearted. Yeah.
Hard-hearted.
Yeah, he doesn't want to forgive that younger brother. He deeply resents him, and frankly, he resents the dad, right? He resents the dad for not throwing a party for him, and he doesn't realize he could have had a party at any time, right? His dad's all loving. His dad would have thrown him a party, but he never asked, right? And so what's interesting about this story is that imagine, let's just take it back to reality here. Jesus one day is talking in front of a group of Pharisees as well as his disciples, and he tells this story, right? The people he's telling this story to are not going to identify with the younger brother, right? The Pharisees are all about obeying the rules. The disciples, they're hanging out with Jesus, right? They've decided they're throwing their lot in with God, right? They're hoping that this guy is the Son of God and is a Messiah and will save Israel. These are obedient people he is talking to. They're not the people who have, are going to wander away from Jesus and go, spend their money on hookers and blow. That's not what's about to happen, right? These people are obedient people. So this coda of the story is basically Jesus' way of saying, I know you feel superior to the prodigal son, but the son in this story who you should be paying attention to is the older brother, because I think that's you guys. Right? Because, and Jesus is posing a challenge, saying, why is it that the obedient ones aren't very forgiving? Right? And it's a question mark. Why aren't the obedient ones more forgiving? Because the father seems to have a lot of sympathy for the kid who screwed up.
The obedient ones have mistaken duty for love. Mm-hmm. They've confused the two. They are living not a life of love, but a life of duty, which shows a lack of faith.
Yeah, and I think as someone said before, they expect something in exchange for all that duty,
Mm.
right? You know, the obedient brother doesn't say, "Hey, what's all that music in the house about?" And you know, one of the slaves says, "Oh, your younger brother's just come back." He doesn't say, "My younger brother who used to go fishing with, my younger brother who I used to play in the dirt with, my younger brother who, you know, used to kid me and I used to kid him." He doesn't say any of those things.
Mm.
He just goes, "Huh, he's back." And all the wonderful aspects of his younger brother get narrowed down to the fact that he left. And it's even worse now because dad's taking him back,
Mm.
right? So this radical simplification of a whole person down to just his perceived crimes. And
But the-
Jesus
the
is
older-
saying, sorry?
Stephen?
The older son has to have carried this resentment toward his dad long before this. To me, there just seems to be no forgiveness for the dad, that he would be that loving, like just none.
Yeah.
This resentment and anger, and so he's missed out on a lot of love, I think, the older son.
Yeah. Yeah. And Jesus is talking to a bunch of people who make significant sacrifices so they can be religious, right? You know, the Pharisees were known for being more observant than anybody else. And so they know what it's like to pay their dues over and over again. And Jesus is saying, are you expecting a reward for all that? Wendy and then Shirley.
I'm just wondering if the older son also would have liked to have gone out and had some fun and, you know, lived a little bit different and separated a little bit from the father, and has a lot of anger and resentment because he didn't follow his own impulses, whether they are labeled good or bad, right?
Yeah.
Probably had to override a lot to stay dutiful.
Yeah, he may just be intensely jealous that the younger brother was able to do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like more fun than staying on the farm and just, you know, punching the clock every day, right? Absolutely.
Mm.
Shirley, did you have something to say too?
Yeah, I was, excuse me, I got too much coffee this morning. I think it's always interesting to think about intention. And I try to do that with myself, because you can really stop yourself, say, why am I really doing that? And what I don't know is, do we know why the young son took off? Was it to explore and to have fun? Is that why he left? Or was it tough living on the farm? I don't know.
There's no implication that it was tough living on the farm. It sounds like he was just a young man who wanted to go off and party and, you know, go sow his wild oats. So,
but I love it's all about the intention, and that's what we're talking about. You know, like, why was I such a good son? Well, because I wanted, you know, my part of the farm, of the estate, you know. Anyway.
yeah. Mom?
I think I can relate to the father's feelings in this situation, where he would be disappointed that the elder son is not forgiving and accepting to the younger son. And I've been in a situation where I asked forgiveness, even though in my own mind, I didn't need forgiveness at all. I had nothing wrong. But the people wouldn't forgive me, this family. And that is very, very painful when you offer forgiveness, even though you don't think you need to, and it still is not accepted.
Mm-hmm.
That's a hurt.
Yeah. You know, I've when I was doing the research for this session, somebody said, when you say to someone, please forgive me, that actually makes the situation worse. And for this reason, imagine if the crime was stealing somebody's car, right? So, you know, you're young, you steal somebody's car, and then you bring it back, but you feel bad and you say, please forgive me. Well, when you stole their car, you robbed them of the use of their car. You basically impaired their free will, right? You said, my will is more important than your will because I'm taking your car, right? When a person then says, please forgive me, you're saying, I got my way the first time, and I want my way the second time too. This time I want you to forgive me. I took your car the first time. The second time, I want you to do another thing that I want, which is to forgive me. Forgiveness doesn't really work like that. Like, coarse forgiveness is no forgiveness at all. It's got to be sincere, and people only get there when they're ready to get there. And when we ask someone else to forgive us, you're saying, could we just hurry this along, please? I want to get to the point where we're good again. I want to heal this relationship on my terms, even though, frankly, I broke it on my terms. Right? So we have to be careful about asking for forgiveness, because often people will say, forget it. I'm still dealing with the first thing you did to me. Right? They'll forgive you in their own good time. And then that of course raises a question of, well, what softens people up so they're willing to forgive? And that's what our next story is about. So for this one, I need 5 readers. Okay, Mom, Jocelyn, Andre, Roseby, and Barb. Thank you.
Okay. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears.
Great, thank you. And Jocelyn, you're next.
Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner.
Great, thank you. And Andre?
Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain money lender. One owed him 500 denarii, and the other owed him 50. Sorry, my scream. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Wow.
Thank you. And Rosie, if you could read this, please.
Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she put perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little.
Thank you. And Barb, if you could read this last part, please.
And Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace.
Great, thank you. Okay, so. All right, so first reactions to that story?
Well, the quantification really threw me.
In that little parable he tells, you mean?
Yeah.
So how did it throw you?
Well, how was it a function of degree? And how can you measure this situation, which is not measurable by degrees? And what does it say about the person who's measuring it more than the person who's asking for forgiveness? And it goes on.
Yeah, so Jesus says, you know, two people owed somebody money. One owed them 100 denarii, which is like a day's wages. The other person owes them 50. Who do you think is going to, you know, be more loving and more appreciative of having been forgiven? And the answer is, well, the person who was forgiven the greatest debt. And Jesus says, yes, you judged well. All right, so how does that apply to people in real situations then? Let's talk about this woman. Okay, so Jesus goes to dinner, Pharisee's house. The Pharisees are the super well-behaved people. They're even more punctual. They're even more observant than the temple officials. They pride themselves on this. They know the Torah. They know the laws, both in terms of behavior as well as book learning. They know the whole thing. So they, of course, think that Jesus is going to be on their side in every argument, because if Jesus is really from God, then he should know they're the best behaved people in the room. Right? So Jesus goes to dinner with them. And then in comes this woman who the Pharisee says is a sinner. Everybody knows she's a sinner. And she makes a beeline for Jesus's feet with a jar of alabaster, an alabaster jar, so an expensive jar with perfume in it. She pours it on his feet, and she's weeping, and she's wiping his feet with her tear, with her hair. She was not invited to this party. That kind of woman would never be invited to this party. And yet she barges in and she does this extraordinary, bizarre thing at his feet, no less. So what's going on? And who is Jesus? Whose side is Jesus on?
Jesus.
Oh, sorry, Wendy first.
I hear it as suffering, like she really knows what suffering is. She suffered greatly. Not that the perfect people haven't either, but they're not as in touch with the pain as she is.
Yeah, right. Indeed. Shirley?
I think that this woman is giving a gift, you know, a very important gift from herself to him. With, you know, an expensive alabaster jug and then oil. I'm sure it is expensive and blah, blah, blah. But I think it is puzzling, but there's also something very important that she's washing his feet. And I'm not totally sure what that is, but I know that it's very symbolic in the Bible, and I'd like to know more about that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it was customary that if you came to somebody's house, because everybody wore sandals, right? They didn't wear boots. So they're wearing sandals, you know, it's a warm climate. So their feet are always going to be dusty when they come into a house. And it was customary for the slaves to come forward and wash a guest's feet. And it was also customary for people to have oil poured on their heads, which from our perspective sounds disgusting. But back then, that was a sign of respect, that you would pour oil on a guest's head, like not drench them, but just a little bit of olive oil or something would go into their heads. Often it was perfumed kind of oil. And Jesus points out, Simon, I came to your house. You did not offer to wash my feet, and you didn't pour any oil on my head. This woman has poured oil on, or perfume on my feet, and she hasn't stopped cleaning my feet since I walked in. So she really gets who Jesus is, right? Whereas Simon says to himself, and we hear that it's his thoughts, right? If this man was really a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this is, if he was a prophet. So for Simon, he's still on the fence about who Jesus is, right? He claims to be a big deal, but let's have him over for dinner and, you know, see. Maybe I can ask him a few questions and see if I can trip him up, right? But Jesus is saying, hey, this woman walked in, she barged in, she knew exactly who I was, and she treated me like someone important. You did not. You didn't even offer me to come and... Sorry, Rosie?
Stephen, that woman with the perfume and the expensive jar, did she do that because she already knew she wasn't welcome at that party and she wanted to make a big entrance and do the right thing? with the washing of the feet and crying and wiping the tears and so on.
Well, the host of the party is the Pharisee, and she ignores him.
Mm.
So she's probably not trying to impress anybody in that sense. Marilyn? And you're muted, Marilyn.
Because sometimes I'm coughing. I'm just getting over a cold. At the end, Jesus offers her forgiveness. Your sins are forgiven. So he would have been known by reputation already. So my sense is that, as Wendy was saying earlier, she was full of pain, suffering, but I had a sense she was, even though you said earlier to go say, please forgive me, I think she was coming in a repentant way as well, also honoring Jesus. But my sense is she needed forgiveness. She needed to be free from whatever burden that she was carrying, and Jesus would have known that in her. It just, we don't know, but it sounds like she would have accepted the forgiveness and been made whole and went off to do her life in a different way. But interesting to say to the Pharisees, I forgave her.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where this story is kind of tricky, because I agree that is the interpretation that one would expect, given what's said, particularly at the end by Jesus. But Jesus, before we get to that part where he speaks explicitly about her and forgiveness, he offers this parable, right? He offers this parable about there was a man who lent money to two other men, and neither one of them could pay him back. So he forgave both of them. And the one who owed the most money was the one who was most loving, right? And most appreciative. Right, so Jesus is talking about once upon a time there were two men who were loving because they had been forgiven. Right? He says that before he starts talking about the woman, comparing her to Simon. So I'm just going to take you back to the text, because I admit this is subtle, but I think it's important. So this is the story about the two men, right? Now, which of them will love him more? Love him more, right? And Simon says, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. Jesus says, you judge correctly. So Jesus is saying in this mini parable that those who have been forgiven will be more loving. That's the point of this parable, right? Like that's what he says. Which of them will love him more? The one who has had the bigger debt forgiven. Okay. And then Jesus starts talking about the woman. I'll just read this out. Then he turned towards the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven lives little, loves little. Okay, so this is the thing where you got to get the cart and the horse in the right order. Jesus is saying in that last line, whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Great love comes from people who have been forgiven. Been forgiven, past tense. In the previous line, 47, therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. She barged in with great love. She's not waiting for forgiveness. She has already been forgiven. That's why she came in with great love, and that audacious act of barging into a Pharisee's house with a jar of perfume and crying at the feet of the Son of God. The only reason she could do that was because she's already been forgiven. She's not anticipating forgiveness. She's already been forgiven. That's what Jesus is saying. So it's actually a really, really big point, and it's a hard one to take in because we're so used to Jesus just forgiving people. Everybody he meets, hey, you're forgiven, you're forgiven, you're forgiven. But his point here is she got forgiven before she walked into your house. And it wasn't me. She hadn't met me. This woman, who is known as a sinner in the town, has come to a spiritual realization that despite being a sinning woman, she is forgiven. And she is so grateful for that, like those two guys whose debts were written off. She is so grateful for that, that she has run into this house to thank me, thank Jesus, who she sees as being related to the one who forgave her, which is God. And then he turns, but the implication of this is those for whom little has been forgiven means that they will not be very loving. Okay. And Jesus says this to the Pharisee in a chiding manner, because he says, you've been judging me the whole time I've been here. You didn't wash my feet. You didn't give me oil. You didn't give me a kiss. As far as you're concerned, the jury is still out about who I am. This whole dinner party is conditional as far as you're concerned. And you certainly didn't forgive this woman because you're saying, hey, don't you know who she is? Right? For all your obedience, Simon, you are not a very forgiving person. You're not a very loving person. If you were, you might have taken pity on this woman. If you were more loving, maybe you would have greeted me saying, I don't know if you're the real thing, but here's a kiss, here's some washing of your feet. I'll treat you like a regular guy. Even though I'm not quite sure who you are, still, I'm going to love you. But instead you went, until I know who you are, I'm not giving you the regular treatment that I give a typical dinner guest. Shirley and then Wendy.
So the prior reading, which Jesus at the end says the word judge, you judged me right or something. I find, maybe it's in translation, but I find it strange that Jesus uses the word judge because he's not judging. Am I being finicky? Like that might be just lost in translation. I don't know.
Yeah, the thing is, Jesus is speaking obviously in the biblical tradition, right? And there's a whole book in the Old Testament, Hebrew scriptures, called the Book of Judges. And in modern English, when we think of judging, it sort of has two meanings, right? There's the sort of moral judgment of, I judge you to be a sinner, you're a write-off, I don't want to talk to you, cancel culture, all that kind of judging, right? So it's got a very negative connotation. But there's also the positive connotation of, say, like the Supreme Court, where we're thankful that they have thoughtfully thought through disputes and come to a judgment which is fair, which is what we hope they do. In the biblical tradition, judging also means that. So when he says, you have judged well, Simon, he's saying you have understood this situation well.
Okay, yeah.
And Wendy, I think you had something to say.
I just had a question. So how do we know that she knows she's been forgiven before she rushes in? Because I could hear that a different way. I could hear that out of desperation, so nothing else matters, because she understands who Jesus is, but she's willing to wash his feet and do all those things to be forgiven. So
I think this is why this little parable that Jesus tells is so critical, because that is a totally reasonable conclusion to this story. But the writer of the gospel, Luke, inserts this parable so that we'll know that that's not what's going on here. And it's very interesting that he does it. And because Jesus's parable is, who will be more loving? Well, the one who's been forgiven most. So if someone walks in being loving, it means they've been forgiven, right? That's what that parable means. And he's saying it so that it will be applied to this situation of a woman who bursts through the door of the enemy, of those who judge her, to be loving to one man in the room, right? Where she's crying and stuff. And so I think that Jesus is saying, and I'm taking this from Paul Tillich, a theologian who wrote about this in the 50s, it's not just me. I think Jesus is saying, the reason she's being so loving to me is because she has been forgiven so much. And the reason you're being judgmental, Simon, is because you don't think you need to be forgiven for anything. Because you're a goody two-shoes. You think you're doing everything right, so you don't need to be forgiven. But the price of that attitude, it's not necessarily a fact, right? But it's an attitude, is that you're not great on the love front. Those who have been forgiven much will love much. What, Marilyn?
The image of the woman bursting in, and as you say, you know, the forgiving previous, to me also gives me an image of someone who has forgiven herself.
Mm-hmm.
So that to me is the spiritual transformation. We talk so much about, that God forgives us, but to come to a place to forgive herself and just out, like love just pouring out of her. I'm just finding that, like, even in my own mind now, transforming that image of her just pouring out love because she has received and accepted and believes she's forgiven. And to me, that's beautiful.
Yeah, and this is one of the big challenges for people with Christianity, right? We have the reputation of being very judgmental, which is unfortunate, but well, I guess we've earned that. But our book says, nope, actually, that is not a good road to go down. You should not be judgmental and unforgiving. You should be forgiving. And these stories are saying that the forgiving one is the loving one, right? But often we'll say, well, you know what? I obey all the rules. I don't break any of the 10 commandments. It's all good. And therefore we must be okay. We must be okay with God, right? And then when we hear that Jesus Christ died on the cross to forgive all of our sins, to wash our sins away, often there's a voice in your head that says, well, you didn't need to because I haven't done anything wrong. Sins of the world, sins of other people, okay, but me, no, I'm fine. You don't have to worry about me. I'm good, you know? So let's look at another story that deals with exactly that kind of issue, okay, about the attitude in your head. And I need 3 readers for this one.
I'll do
Okay, who else? Sorry, Marilyn and Jocelyn. Okay, great, thank you. And this again comes from the Gospel of Luke.
The parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector.
Thank you. And Marilyn?
The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get.
Great, thank you. And Jocelyn?
But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to the heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalted themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the religious expert is up there. Is he a loving person?
judging.
Mm-hmm. Thank goodness I'm not one of those other people. Thank goodness I'm not that guy in the back.
Yep.
Right? So he feels more important than other people, right? And just for historical context, tax collectors, who aren't popular even now, but it's easier now that we submit our taxes online and stuff. Tax collectors back then were considered traitors because they were collecting taxes for the Romans. So, and the Romans would hire Jews to do the work, and they would make their living off of basically skimming money off the top. So they would overcharge people for their taxes so that they could take a commission for themselves and then hand the money over to the hated Romans. So whenever Jesus is talking about tax collectors, he's talking about very, very unpopular people. But how does the tax collector feel about himself? How does he express himself standing at the back of that temple?
He
I have
asked for-
sinned.
I have
Yeah.
sinned. Yeah. Yeah. He's
and
go ahead.
maybe it's the only job he knows and can do, and he knows it. He's aware anyway. Self-awareness. It's probably good.
Yeah. He actually has a fair degree of self-awareness. It's not an easy place to be, but he's in touch with his feelings and in touch with the moral implications of what he's been doing. And who does Jesus side with in this story?
Him, the tax collector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is unexpected since, we're supposed to be well behaved and follow all the rules and stuff. And yet Jesus once again, 2 stories in a row, 3 stories in a row, has sided with the person who makes the most mistakes.
Mhm.
So what does the prodigal son and the woman with the jar of perfume and the tax collector have in common? Wendy?
Their humanness. They're all the different aspects that we all have. I'm not sure how to articulate it, but we all have a part of us that would skim off the money off the top, or I don't know, overindulge, or all of these things that make us human. And when we can acknowledge them, they have less power over us. And I guess, I don't know if I'm simplifying this in a big macro way, but I feel like these stories are telling us, acknowledge that in ourselves, and be in touch with our humanness, and be in touch with God.
Yeah. Rosie?
And
Yeah.
isn't it also a fact that they forgive themselves first and then they react?
I'm not sure if the tax collector has forgiven himself. He seems to be pretty wrought with emotion, right? It's possible that the woman had, but the prodigal son hasn't forgiven himself, right? He comes crawling back saying, "I'm not worthy to be your son. Just make me one of your slaves." He is contrite, right? Like Wendy's right. He is fully in touch with his humanity. He's fully in touch with all the worms inside him, right? And he's feeling bad about it, and he realizes that he's messed up. Whereas the woman she seems to know herself, but she also is full of appreciation and love as a result, right? And Wendy, I think, is put her finger on an important point, that capacity for just self-examining and being in touch with your feelings, knowing where you're at, even if you're not in a good place, is in these stories more valuable than having a lack of self-awareness, but a keen sense of the failings of others. Right? And there's a famous story about this, and I won't ask you to read it, I'll just read it. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, "Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye," when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye.
Isn't it also, let he who is, I've forgotten how to say it.
Without sin.
Yeah,
Cast
exactly. Throw the first stone. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's so, Jesus is making it really clear, like, where are you going to find someone without sin? Yeah, because the story you guys are quoting from is the story about the adulterous woman that they bring forward, and they say, "Hey, this woman's an adulterous woman. We're going to stone her to death." And Jesus says, "Well, okay, feel free to start throwing stones, but make sure it's the person who has no sin that throws the first stone." And they all wander off, right? Because at least they have enough self-awareness to go, "Oh, no, that's not me." And one by one, they all take off, right? And yet that Pharisee in the temple is there saying, "I fast twice a week, I do this, I do that. Thank goodness I'm not like any of those other people." He lacks self-awareness. He lacks an awareness that he is a flawed person, right? That he messes up on a regular basis. Tax collector is well aware that he is a flawed person. But the Pharisee, who claims to be the most spiritually aware person in the room, is the one who is least spiritually aware because he is unable to examine himself. And keep in mind, Jesus is talking to the people who think that they are the most religiously obedient, right? So that's why he keeps bringing this back to the obedient people. He doesn't tell all these stories about how bad the sinners are. He's telling these stories about, watch out, people. If you want to follow me, you need to be self-aware rather than just aware of the faults of others. Right?
An indictment of the church from centuries.
A continuing indictment of the church. Right? But this is just a part of human nature, which obviously is at least 2,000 years old, where our egos say, "I'm fine. Somebody else is at fault. Somebody else is a sinner, but I'm fine," right? We escape self-awareness by judging others, and that short circuits our capacity to be forgiving and loving, even when you think you are the most religious person in the room. Wendy? Oh, okay. No, I thought you unmuted yourself because you're about to say something.
I will say something. I mean, I think that's how we escape pain, right? That which is also very human, that we don't, that the word suffering I used earlier, I think that's what I mean. Like we do these things, we have the plank in the other person's eye to escape pain.
Yeah, because it's hard to do that self-examination. Nobody wants to live in their own pain, right? It's much easier to blame other people.
And remain superior.
Mm-hmm. And remain superior. Yeah, exactly.
Nice protection.
Yeah.
So I find this, I can tell you a few Christian people in this day and age in my life, and I refer to them as the black hats and the white hats. And they're always the white hats, and everybody else is a black hat. There is no such thing in their life as a gray hat. Right. And so I think that I tend to live my life in a gray zone, sitting on the fence, like everybody's got a point of view. And that is not the way the sort of super religious and whatever look at life. They just simply don't have a point of view where anybody's gray. You're either black or white.
Yeah. And, especially, back in the day when Jesus was living, the Jews had a lot of rules, right? It wasn't just the 10 Commandments. There were like 600 mitzvahs that they were supposed to obey. Don't eat shellfish, don't do this on this day. There were all sorts of rules that they were supposed to obey. Very difficult to do. And we still see that among some of the Jewish populations which persist, like the Orthodox Jews and the Hasidic Jews, right? But the part of the Christian revolution was that Paul said, you know what? We don't have to do that anymore. Forget about all that stuff. It doesn't matter, as Jesus said, it doesn't matter what you eat. You don't have to worry about dietary restrictions. What matters is what comes out of your heart, right? And so Christians sort of let go of a lot of rules relative to how many rules the Jews had been obeying. And in modern life, particularly among liberal Christians, we've let go of even more rules, right? We're very, very permissive in all sorts of ways that would have shocked Christians from earlier centuries. And that can lead to an attitude that, well, there's not that many rules I need to obey, basic 10 Commandments stuff. And so I'm good. And a lot of churches, like our church at Lawrence Park, we don't start with a general confession. Right? Lots of more traditional churches do, where every week everybody gets together and says, forgive me for what I have done this week. I did all these bad things, right? And then you pass the peace. Right? You don't pass the peace until you've asked for forgiveness, because what if you have a grudge against someone else in the congregation? You need to unburden yourself of that. Then you can pass the peace and shake hands with everybody. That's the logic of that. In a lot of liberal churches, we've gotten rid of that because we're pretty good. We're not doing anything wrong, right? But what all these stories have told us is the more you think that you don't have sin in you, the less likely you are to be forgiving and the less likely you are to be loving. But there's this paradoxical relationship between a degree of self-awareness where you realize, oh man, I am just a walking mess. But that allows you to actually feel greater empathy towards other people who are also walking messes. So that's just the human condition. And it also means that you're more likely to forgive them and forgive yourself and know that God forgives you. But all of that happens because you realize that you're a walking mess, that there's things which you do wrong, which you may not even mean to do wrong, or you just keep doing wrong because you can't seem to resist, or you're just part of systems that do things wrong. And since this is a liberal Christian church, I'd like to remind us all of God's perspective on this. So I'll read this part. This is from the prophecy of Isaiah, chapter 1. So, you don't have to dig deep to find this. In Isaiah, the Jews are living in Jerusalem, and Isaiah says bad things are going to happen because you guys haven't been behaving in a way which is suitable to God. And so this is how Isaiah puts it in the very first chapter. The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough of burnt offerings, of rams, and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and, sorry, did I spotlight that? Sorry. I will make it bigger. There we go. So, I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. Stop bringing me meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I am not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. That's what the Hebrew scriptures say that faithful people should be doing, taking care of others who are marginalized and oppressed. Until you do that, you're all sinning. And you're not even admitting it to yourselves. Right? So the bar is actually set very, very high in the Hebrew scriptures. And the book of Isaiah, the prophecy of Isaiah, is being called the fifth gospel because the New Testament writers quote from it so often. And when Jesus has his sort of coming out party as a Messiah, he's standing in a synagogue and he pulls open Isaiah and he reads from Isaiah and then he says, I'm that guy. I'm the one you're waiting for. So you can always know that Jesus and Isaiah speak in the same way. And Jesus says very clearly, anytime you help the poor, anytime you help the widow, anytime you help the prisoner, you were helping me. There's no ambiguity here. The sort of what we might now call the social justice agenda of the liberal church is entirely in keeping with the scriptural witness about what God expects of us. And in modern terms, that means that the persistent oppressions of racism and sexism, and homophobia and transphobia and classism, all of those ways in which our society oppresses and marginalizes people and prevents them from flourishing, the extent to which we participate in that, either passively or actively, is a sin. It's part of the sins which we carry. And it doesn't mean that as individuals we can fix that. Just, oh, tomorrow I'm going to end racism. It doesn't work like that, right? But we participate in systems which perpetuate these injustices. The scriptural witness says, all of you have problems with God as long as this is happening. It also says, Jesus was on the cross saying, forgive them for they know not what they do. I'm going to forgive you in an ongoing matter, but I want you to at least try to understand that you are people who mess up. And if you can understand that you mess up, I promise, first of all, I will forgive you, and you will become more loving and forgiving yourselves. So for anybody who walks around going, hey, I obey the 10 commandments, I'm fine, the scriptural witness says that's not enough. There's all sorts of problems. There's all sorts of populations who are being held back from having a nice life because of the way society is structured, and we all bear some responsibility for that. So I just want to point out that you're and the other way of putting it, as John 1 says, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, God is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. If we claim we have not sinned, we make Christ out to be a liar and God's word is not in us. So this isn't my fire and brimstone moment, but I'm just trying to point out that we're all, we're all sinners to some degree. And that's not a punishment. It's not a judgment. It's just kind of a fact. And if we can just come to terms with that, then it actually opens us up. It makes us into different, more loving people. So that's it on a systemic level, but what do you do at a personal level, right? Because, we can write checks to good organizations, we can go to protest rallies, we can write letters to politicians, but when it comes down to forgiveness, often it's not those sorts of meta issues which are really torturing us. It's interpersonal ones, right? Where someone has done us wrong, maybe we've done somebody wrong. How do you get over that? Okay, forgiveness is a good thing, but how do you do it, right? How do you actually get there? One of the things which Christ says on the cross, again from Luke, when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said to them, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. How many times have you heard the voice in your head, I can't believe he or she did that to me. Didn't they know it was going to hurt me this way, this way, this way, this way, this way, this way, this way? Ever had that feeling?
Yep.
Yeah. It's, someone hurts us, and then it's like they shoot us with a gun. A bullet enters us, and it starts ricocheting around. And the one hurt becomes a second hurt, becomes a third hurt, becomes a fourth hurt. And then there's this fifth and sixth and seventh and eighth thing, which you didn't even expect would be a consequence of that first hurt, but it is. And you just wander around really, really angry at that person for having caused all 8 or all 100 of those hurts. But Jesus on the cross says, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Do you think the person who hurt you knew all the ways that hurt was going to hurt you? Could they know?
Maybe only some of them, not some of the hurt, I mean.
Yeah, only some of them. And one way of thinking about this is that people are like icebergs. Right. The very top is what we see in a person. That's the way they present themselves, what they look like physically, how they present themselves. Oh, they're very polite, they're articulate, they're nice, right? And then underneath the water that you cannot see are all their inner motivations, their past personal history, their hidden feelings, their conscious and unconscious motivations. Everybody does things that they don't even understand why they're doing them. That happens to us all the time. I can't believe I said that. Well, some part of me wanted to say that, but it wasn't the part of me at the top, right? It was something deep down, you know? Well, I thought I was going to go to the party, but instead I decided to go shopping. Well, because some deep part of me didn't want to go to that party, so I went shopping instead, right? Like, we're full of conflicting things, right? So when someone hurts you, often they hurt you not just at the surface, but below the surface, in that mystery that you are, that big wholeness of you that you don't even understand, right? But when we think of them, when we refuse to forgive someone, we oversimplify them. And we forget that they are just as mysterious as we are. They're just as whole as we are. That they have all sorts of hidden motivations that may be hidden even to them, right? Instead, we just go, they're the person who hurt me. That whole mystery, that whole wonderful aspect, they can play music, they're a good dancer, they're good to their kids, they're good at their job, all of that disappears. They're the person who hurt me, right? They just become a caricature of who they used to be. Because forgiveness is kind of like a form of blindness, right? It's like, you know, the plank in your eye. You don't see it. Does that resonate at all?
Well,
Yeah.
yes, totally.
Totally.
But do you have to ask for forgiveness or to forgive? Can you not just walk your own path and let them walk their own path and never to be seen again? I mean, why does everything need to be resolved, particularly as I bring back the point of view, in my point of view, which you call the lower iceberg, right? That other people don't see our point of view, we don't see their point of view. So there's the thing about agree to disagree and go your own way, you know. And then the other part I'm struggling over is, well, do you ask for forgiveness or do you forgive even though the other guy didn't ask for forgiveness? Or like, what's the difference between asking for forgiveness and not difference? You could ask for forgiveness for your own fault, but the other person maybe doesn't want forgiveness. And so it's a useless exercise. They don't see themselves as at fault.
Well, it's, I mean, yeah, so let's separate those out a little bit, right? Let's say someone did you wrong, right? And you would really like them to apologize, but they're not going to, or they haven't yet, right? And you've got to decide, okay, I'm really mad at them. They did this thing to me. They're not apologizing, so what do I do, right? Well, there's basically two choices. You can just keep blaming them in your head and keep that going, right? Stay angry at them, right? And that will probably narrow your perspective on them. And it will almost certainly harm your relationship with them, may even sever it, right? And, you know, it's that can be hard work in your head and your heart because you just become so bitter and angry at them, right? You carry it. Or you can forgive them. And forgiveness isn't about, forgiveness is about you, right? Like, you know, okay, they stole my car. They're never bringing it back. That's cost me so much money. I had to buy another car. I can't believe it. But I don't know why they did that. I will never really know why they did that. They may not even know why they did that. That's frankly beyond my capacity to understand, if I'm being honest. And I don't want to bear this hurt for the rest of my life, so I'm just going to forgive them. I forgive you for doing that, even though I'm not going to forget that you did that. I can't help but forget. My car's still not in the driveway, but I forgive you for that. I don't know why you did it, but that's frankly not my problem. I'm going to forgive you that you did that. I'm going to move on. That way, at least you unburden yourself from all that burden of hatred and bitterness and stuff, and you can move on. And, 10 years down the line, you may realize, geez, maybe they really needed that car. Maybe they were in a desperate situation and they needed that car. Or, geez, I've stolen stuff. If I'm really honest, when I was a kid, I stole stuff from stores and stuff. Thankfully, I was never in a desperate situation where I need to steal something as big as a car. But, like there's all sorts of ways to start feeling empathy for someone who at first you thought was just like your enemy. But forgiveness is ultimately about unburdening yourself from a meal that can go on forever of hatred and bitterness, which will corrode your soul and not hurt them. Right? As people say, it's like the poison. You drink poison and you expect them to get sick, right?
So just to say, forgiveness can very much be one-sided. You can forgive, and just whatever the other person does really doesn't matter. You can and carry on in your manner and in your life. And if there's a relationship that dies, who cares?
Oh, it's unfortunate, right? But
it's unfortunate, but it's not wrong, or it's not. You don't have to solve everything.
That's right. And you might have noticed, I don't know if this is true in your family, but it's true in some of my extended family, that there are people who are unforgiving, who cut off family members for years at a time, if not longer. And those same people often end up cutting out other people from their life, because there's something intoxicatingly empowering about being so right that you cancel someone else. Your ego loves that. Your ego goes, I'm right, they're wrong, I'm never going to talk to them again. And that can become a very satisfying strategy for getting through life. But the effect of it is that you become more egotistical, you become less loving, you're definitely not forgiving, and it tends to destroy relationships. Often, if someone's cut off a sibling, just watch, they'll cut off other people afterwards, because it seems to work for them, but they're just going down this terrible road, which is corrosive and destructive in their life and the life of others. Mom?
We read about the people who forgive those who have murdered their child. And that, I think, is a perfect example of the fact that you're punishing yourself if you continue to hate, criticize, whatever, the person who did this evil deed.
Yeah, and that's a prime example of, the murderer has no idea how much hurt they are going to cause in the other people, right? Motivations that they have for doing that probably have little or nothing to do with that child or that child's parents. Right? All of these terrible murders where a man loses his job. This happens in the United States with frightening frequency. A man loses his job, can't support his family, and so one day he gets a gun and he shoots his family, then he goes to work and he shoots his co-workers, right? His sense of pride and being and existence is being destroyed by the fact that he can't support his family. And since he can't support his family, in his mind, it makes sense to kill his family, since he can't support them. He can't do what he should do as a man and as a father. This is deeply, deeply sick reasoning, right? But for all the people who are left alive, maybe the kids he didn't manage to kill, the grandparents, the friends, the schoolmates, all of them now have 1,000 hurts, which they blame him for. But the fact of the matter is, he wasn't thinking of them when he did this act. He was really only thinking of himself and his own feelings, right? It was his below the surface iceberg that got the better of him and caused all this hurt. So if other people blame him for that, they're just wasting their emotional energy. It's misplaced, right? And this is where forgiveness becomes huge, because the inability to forgive can kind of stop your life in its tracks. Right. Marilyn?
I often hear people that I meet with around their own spiritual search, that they're the ones that are wanting to be forgiven. They hurt somebody, and they're not getting a sense that they're going to be forgiven.
Right.
And it's the same trap. You know, they can't move on without a visible indication from the other person that they're going to forgive them, that they'll receive the other person's forgiveness. And it becomes such a loop that you need to get free also if you're looking for forgiveness and wanting forgiveness. I can't move on until I feel forgiven. And I think that happens with God as well. I need to feel that I'm forgiven. I need some evidence that I'm forgiven, and I can't take it in. I can't find it. And it becomes a terrible place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's not a coincidence that in AA, you know, one of those 12 steps is you got to realize there's a higher power. It's a higher power that forgives you. And it does say that if you can go and, you know, apologize to the people that you've hurt, but often you can't find them all, and they won't accept your apology. That's why it's so important that there's a third party in this system, which is God, because you can't count on other human beings to forgive you.
Hence the tax collector's prayer.
Yeah, yeah. That's why it's so key that this faith is based on forgiveness. That Jesus, after having the worst possible thing happen to him by human beings, to be killed on a cross was considered the worst thing that could happen to you. Families wouldn't even talk about people in their family who had been crucified. It was so humiliating. Humanity throws the worst it can do to Jesus, and he suffers it willingly, and he forgives them from the cross. That's the get out of jail free card. That's the, no matter what you've done, if you realize that you've done something really terrible, your family may never forgive you, that dead child's not coming back, but God will forgive you. But he won't forgive you if you don't even know you need to be forgiven. Right? If you don't think you need to be forgiven because you didn't do anything wrong, well then you're not going to change, and you're not going to accept God's forgiveness because you're not looking for it. Unfortunately, we can't force other people to be forgiving or loving. People hang on to this for a long time sometimes. Often they'll hang on to it to the very end. Yeah, you know what I would suggest? This may sound Pollyanny-ish, but I would pray on it. I would just pray on it. Prayer is good for you. And I think that prayer and this sort of thing can help. Like, objectively, it can help. But, you know, part of prayer is a recognition that we're not in control, and we can't be in control.
Yeah, that's true.
And we're sort of saying, okay, God, could you do this? Because I can't seem to get anywhere with this. And that's wisdom, right? Like, you know, knowing where your power leaves off and other powers begin is important. And, you know, everything that we've heard today in these scripture readings says, when you realize that you've done something wrong and you're repentant, you can be confident that God will forgive you. That will have the effect in you of enkindling love and forgiveness in you. And sometimes it's that love and forgiveness seen in another who is resented that can inspire a reconciliation. Right. And if nothing else, when a person is loving and forgiving, even if the original person who holds a grudge never changes, you are at least making the world a better place around you.
Is it like what Jocelyn said, though, that you eventually have to just walk away?
Yeah, it depends on the nature of the relationship and whether you want to completely sever ties. If you've forgiven them, you don't need to walk away. It may become a barren relationship because they just don't want to talk to you. Sure, that's possible, right? But I would suggest keep the door open. You know, Jesus says at one point, one of the disciples says, somebody has wronged me. How many times should I forgive him? 7 times, because that's mentioned in the Bible. And Jesus says 7 times 77 times. Just keep forgiving them, right? Because our struggles are internal as much as they are external, probably more internal than external, right? So whoever's not forgiving you is wrestling with something internal, and it's not just about you. It probably reminds them of other relationships they've had in their life and other things that haven't worked out. Like, we're all just bit players in each other's mental melodrama. You know, we just play small parts. You remind me of that other thing which is gigantic that I never resolved, right? So it's not really you, it's you as a trigger for all sorts of other stuff. And you know, we talked about this last year when we talked about Singer's book. He's very good on this. So if you guys have got 10 minutes, actually, Wendy, you had something to say, and then I want to suggest one last thing.
I'm going to say goodbye and thank you for this morning. Stephen, I won't stay to watch the piece from the TV. And I'll leave on a glib thing, and because it came to me while we were reading the parable of the prodigal son. And I will just give you historical context, which is that when I went to school in England, every day started with an assembly. And so I grew up hearing the healing stories, the parables. But I will tell you that whenever they told the parable of the prodigal son, they never went into the coda. So I was actually an adult before I'd ever heard about the older brother.
Wow, doesn't that say volumes? But thank you for joining me this morning. I hope this was useful to you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you all.
See you Sunday, folks. Okay, bye-bye.
Yes, thank you.